Thanks, Colin. It's a real pleasure to welcome Jon Regosin back to the Tufts campus. I first met Jon in the late 1990s when he was a conservation planner with the Nature Conservancy, and he had decided he wanted to get back into research and improve his life. And he worked on the impacts of urbanization on amphibian distributions and populations. And as soon as he finished his PhD, he started working for the state of Massachusetts, first as a reptile and amphibian biologist, then as a regulatory review manager. And after a while, he became the chief of conservation science for the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. And he now is the deputy director of Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. So with that, you're here to hear Jon talk. So take it away, Jon. You're muted.
Oh. Yeah, I realize that. Thanks, Michael. Great to be visiting with Tufts again, back at Tufts in a way. And yeah, as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges and opportunities related to managing wildlife in one of the most densely populated states. So who's MassWildlife and what do we do? We're responsible for the conservation and management of all of the freshwater fish and wildlife in the Commonwealth, and that includes endangered plants and animals. And we also work to connect people with nature through fish and wildlife-based recreation. And what exactly do we do? Well, we protect and manage habitat, manage land. And right now we have over 220,000 acres of land that we manage in our wildlife management areas. We work to manage and restore wildlife populations. We do science-based management. And as I mentioned earlier, we connect people with wildlife and nature through activities like hunting and fishing and bird watching, wildlife watching. And we also have an education and outreach programs. Lastly, we do regulation, and that includes regulating hunting and fishing. We have the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act that we have regulations for. We regulate aspects of the pet trade, the possession and trade of wildlife here in Massachusetts. And so I'm going to touch on some themes related to working in a densely populated state. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about three specific case studies, so to speak. Again, we're the third most populated state. Densely populated. So one issue is, of course, like increasing our efforts to do habitat protection and habitat restoration and management when we have increasing threats like climate change and habitat fragmentation. And we can continue to chip away at that through land acquisition and management. And I'll talk more about that as we go forward. Another big issue that's increasingly takes up our staff time are wildlife in suburban communities. And for example, bear are moving east into eastern suburbs, outer suburbs of Boston, and that creates challenges. We spend a lot of time responding to calls and issues, even things like wild turkey in suburban areas. Now you can flip that around and also say that it's really an opportunity because a lot of people love wildlife, so we can help them better understand what are the wildlife species that are right there in their communities, and better appreciate and understand how to coexist with that wildlife. Another big issue is we're not making any more land. There's only so much open space, out there, and there's competing demands on that land. So I'm going to talk about beach nesting birds, the left-hand picture there, and balancing their needs with recreation. I'm going to talk a little bit about, as we suburbanize, there's less opportunity for hunting in certain areas, deer hunting, and how that can negatively affect forest health. The bottom picture is an example of off-road vehicles damaging an important turtle nesting area. Another trend that we think about and are concerned about is, our society. People are living more and more, moving into urban and suburban areas. They're spending more time in front of screens, less time outdoors. Although with COVID, there's an interesting twist on that. But at any rate, that's the long-term trend. And if people aren't connecting with nature and wildlife and the outdoors, in the long run, they might care less about conservation, and there are funding implications for our agency as well. Also, our society is becoming more diverse, and MassWildlife has traditionally, our constituents have traditionally been more rural folks that are, not all of them, but many of them hunting and fishing. So we're really focusing on, well, we need to engage and serve diverse communities, work more in urban and suburban areas. For example, we have a big Learn to Fish program, but it's not just about fishing, because wildlife is really for everyone, and people relate to wildlife in all different ways. And so, we're working to increase awareness about what we do and what the conservation needs here are in our state. So for example, endangered species isn't just an issue in the tropical rainforests, it's an issue right here in Massachusetts. What our agency does and what the recreational and volunteer opportunities are. The picture here, by the way, is some volunteers that were helping us create an artificial breeding wetland for a threatened species called the eastern spadefoot toad. We're also working to increase opportunities to participate in outdoor activities and volunteer for conservation, as I mentioned. And in the long run, this will increase or at least maintain support for this work. So now I'm going to jump into the first case study, so to speak, and talk a little bit more in depth about issues relating to deer management, mostly in eastern Massachusetts, and forest health. So what do deer eat? Well, simply put, deer eat plants. They eat vegetation. And if you have a lot of deer, they eat more vegetation. And what happens is this has big impacts on the shrub layer in our forests, where there's less diversity of species of shrubs over time, and there's a lower density of shrub cover. Same thing for grasses and sedges and wildflowers that occur on the forest floor. And this can have a cascading effect on the system. So as deer go up, plants go down. But by the way, it's not only in eastern Massachusetts. There are pockets where there are problems in the western central parts of the state. And in some cases, we've had to put up deer fencing to try to protect some populations of state listed endangered plants. The deer can affect the insect populations, birds, bird nesting success. So for example, I have an ovenbird pictured here. That's a ground nesting bird. And if there's less cover on the forest floor, the nests are more vulnerable to predators. So will nature, so to speak, keep deer in balance? The short answer is no. I mean, there's not enough mortality of the adults, particularly the adult females, to keep the deer numbers from increasing. Whereas in the past, pre-colonial, maybe there was. So what happens is the deer increase to numbers where they're damaging the forest and the health of our forests. And eventually you might lead to starvation, but there's already been at that point a lot of damage done to the forest. In North America, we've relied, at least in recent history, we've relied on regulated hunting to manage our deer populations. So how does that work? Well, licensed hunters have to pass a hunter education before they can go out and hunt. Have to pass a hunter education class. If they're going to use a firearm, they have to qualify follow the rules for firearm possession. Then we have a hunting season for deer in the fall into the winter, and the hunters can coexist with other recreational uses, and there's a strong safety record. So specifically, though, the way it works for controlling the deer size of the deer population is we can alter. This map shows the different management zones that we have, so we can alter the number of female deer that can be taken by giving out permits. So if we have a lot of deer in one of the zones and they're damaging the forest, we can issue more permits. And if there's enough hunters and there's enough land available to them, that can then reduce the size of the deer population in subsequent generations. So we have a variety of ways of estimating deer densities, and I'm not going to go into that, but the bottom line is that in eastern Massachusetts, zones 10 and 11, the deer density is quite high, above our target goals. And on the islands, Vineyard and Nantucket, it's really high. And our goals are in the range of 12 to 18 deer per square mile, which will be acceptable for the forests. Some areas have particularly high densities of deer, isolated pockets. So the major roadblock to managing deer this way, and this is particularly true in an urbanizing, suburbanizing state with a lot of people, is that you can have large blocks of forest closed to hunting, whether it's town forests or conservation lands. There are discharge setbacks, and those are, you can't discharge an arrow or a firearm within 150 feet of a road. You can't hunt within 500 feet of a dwelling. So as the landscape gets more fragmented with roads and houses, there's less and less of the open space that you can hunt on. And then on top of that, there are local ordinances and bylaws that can place extra restrictions on hunting. So in red here, I'm showing you an area that has high deer density in eastern Massachusetts, and you can see that many of the municipalities have extra restrictions on hunting. So we are working a lot with suburban communities and suburban major landholders in those communities to try to address this issue. And basically are there ways to allow more access for hunting on some of the lands in these areas? I'm not gonna go into detail on this, but there aren't really any other options that really are effective and that don't require huge amounts of resources. So there are barriers to hiring marksmen to call deer, and there's social acceptance issues with that anyway. And they would face the same restrictions that I just talked about with setbacks. Moving deer has all kinds of problems. You might have heard about contraception and sterilization. That also very expensive. It doesn't directly lower the deer density. There are deer constantly moving into these landscapes. So there are barriers basically to using other methods. This is a model of an area that has a high deer density. So this is starting out at say 50, that's a very high deer, 50 deer per square mile. And even though some of the deer might not be in the best condition because they're starting to negatively impact the forest, the females are still gonna, unless it gets really dire, produce 1 to 2 offspring per year. Fawns per year. So the population can even continue to creep up even though we're having really bad impacts on the forest. If you introduce hunting, and you can do it in 2 phases. So if you have hunting where in the early phases, you're taking out you're allowing the harvest of a lot of females and maybe allowing a lot of hunting methods if you can bring the population down. And then in the maintenance phase, you would reduce the number of antlerless deer permits and maybe there can be other restrictions on the hunting. So again, we're working with a lot of suburban communities. One option is just to allow hunting and just follow the state laws. That's what the statewide model means. And for example, the town of Berlin has done that on their town lands, and it seems to be working well. The other option that a lot of suburban communities are increasingly considering or implementing is controlled hunts, where you can limit the number of hunters, or maybe you only allow archery on subset of the lands that are there. And just bear in mind, the more restrictions, the less you're going to be effective at reducing the deer numbers. So I'll just give an example of the town of Weston, where they had increasing deer numbers starting to impact the forest, vehicle collisions. They opened the town lands to archery hunting. And then nearby landowners actually allowed hunters to hunt within 500 feet with written permission. So you can see in blue was kind of like the harvest levels before they implemented this. And then they more than doubled the harvest when they allowed the controlled hunt. And this started to take out, remove substantial numbers of deer. I mean, time will tell how effective this is long term, but that's an example of how this works. So I'm going to move on out of this section pretty soon, but I just want to point out that it's not just MassWildlife saying this. Increasingly, whether it's land trusts or the municipalities, they're seeing, understanding the potential negative impacts if we don't manage our deer population. So a lot of the slides that I'm showing you today came out of a presentation that we did jointly with some of our partners at a recent land trust conference. So in summary, in urban, suburban Massachusetts, deer management is a challenge. If we don't manage, we have potentially a problem. We're working with folks to try and address that. Social acceptance is really important. People understand why we do this and what the potential benefits to forest ecology are. And lastly, I just mentioned, because there's a lot of concern now about sustainable agricultural, sustainable sources of meat, and impacts of climate on our climate. Eating deer is carbon neutral and healthy, and we have a ways to go before we have to worry about sustainability. We can take more deer out of our forests without a problem right now. So now I'm gonna go on to my second case that I want to talk about, which is very different from the first one. And this is talking about this ground nesting bird called the piping plover, which is a federally threatened species. And it's also listed under the Massachusetts and protected under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. And there's something on the order of like 7,000 of these birds worldwide. They nest on the ground, as I said, they nest on the ground, and the chicks, this is a chick, it can't fly for 25 to 30 days. So it needs to walk around and feed on the beach in the intertidal zone. So you can imagine how that presents challenges if you have a lot of recreational activity. And Massachusetts is really kind of at the epicenter, I guess I'll say, of piping plover conservation. In 1986, when the bird was listed, we had about 125 breeding pairs. Today, we have about 750 breeding pairs. And that success hasn't been duplicated in other parts of the Atlantic coast. So in 86, we accounted for about 18% of the population, and now we're over 35% of the population. So we're big players for global conservation of this species. And why are we successful here in Massachusetts? that's a complicated question, but at least part of the answer is management. We have strong guidelines. We have state and federal guidelines that beach operators have to follow if they have birds nesting on their beach. And because we have a strong Mass Endangered Species Act, we're able to really enforce this. And so some of the requirements, and anyone who's been to a beach just about in Massachusetts has probably seen this, but there's symbolic fencing that is required so that the birds, when they're setting up territories and trying to nest, they won't be disturbed by pedestrians or vehicles or anything. And then there's also restrictions on, or the nests won't be trampled. There's restrictions on vehicle use. So you can't drive off-road vehicles, oversand vehicles when there are unfledged chicks present, or drive regular vehicles. We'll get into that in parking lots and things. There's also, I'm not going to get, there's also, you have to, if you're going to have pets or dogs on the beach, they have to be leashed as well. So again, why are we successful here? Well, part of it is this strong Mass Endangered Species Act, but the bottom line is it requires cooperation from the landowners, the beach operators, whether they're towns or private or nonprofit organizations that are running these beaches. And in the early years, when we put these restrictions on, there was a lot of resistance. People were really unhappy. And over time, it's been embraced. And beach operators are spending a lot of money, for example, hiring staff to monitor the birds. And so what's happened over time, especially about 5+ years ago when this came to a head, was there was a feeling, well, we're being penalized for good management, because the more birds that there are, the more fencing we have to put up, and the more that just by chance, there's going to be a late, if I got more pairs of birds on my beach, then there'll be a late pair that has chicks really late in the season, and that can shut down the whole rest of my beach to oversand vehicles. All the rest of the beach, the birds have left. I can't use the rest of my beach. You're more likely to have birds just wandering into parking lots, or even in some cases, if it's not paved, they nest in parking lots, or they cross roads. And that's where the beach operators get their revenue from parking and things like that. So there's a feeling they're being penalized for doing the right thing. And that it is becoming more and more restrictive, even though the birds are doing better. And so it's a very negative us versus them, people versus the birds. So we needed to really work on like reframing that discussion. Is there a better way that doesn't sacrifice the birds, but is more accommodating to the needs of some of these beach operators and communities? So we set about a process of looking at that. Took over 2 years. Can we come up with a different system that, again, still advances conservation of the birds, but it incentivizes plover conservation? Instead of creating a disincentive for more birds, can we create an incentive? Can we, again, improve the recreational opportunities, or make it easier for beach operators to manage both birds and recreational users? Can we change that dynamic? Can we increase cooperation and reduce the conflict? And also, can we have a more, I'm not going to get into this too much, but a more simple regulatory process, because there were 2 agencies involved, us and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, whoop. So what is this thing, this HCP? What it is we said, MassWildlife said, okay, we will apply for an umbrella permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The reason this needs a permit is because it's a federally threatened species. And we're going to make some changes, which I'm going to get into, in how we regulate the birds and the recreational uses. We're used to being the ones that issue permits, but in this case, we're actually going to apply on everyone's behalf. And then beach operators can opt into this system. It's entirely voluntary. We can give out some, It's one-stop shopping. You don't have to deal with us and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but you have to agree to implement the conditions in this habitat conservation plan. And then we had to come up with what so that was the framework, but we worked for quite a while with stakeholders to develop the conditions. It has to meet the standards that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had in place, but we had a lot of flexibility. So we got a lot of folks together. We hired a professional facilitator called the Consensus Building Institute. And it was a diverse group. Like we had a lot of representatives from the towns you can see on this list. And that includes folks who are concerned about the birds, but also who are very concerned about economic development and recreation. We had conservation organizations like Mass Audubon. They're a real leader in plover conservation, and they monitor birds on a lot of beaches under contract with a lot of towns. We had the Mass Beach Buggy Association that was very concerned about what they saw was increasing restrictions, and a bunch of folks. And we spent a long time trying to work together to come up with a plan. The key elements of the plan, it authorizes what we call covered activities. And what those are deviations from the guidelines. So normally you can't drive near the birds, near the unfledged chicks. But with this plan, we can allow on a limited basis, if there's one brood, for example, blocking the rest of your beach, say in late July or early August, if you meet certain conditions, we can allow some driving near those broods, or we can allow some reduction of fencing. Or if your parking lot is going to be shut down because there's birds nesting in it, if you do certain things, we can allow you to continue to operate at least a portion of your parking area. So some of what you need to do if you're a beach operator is there impact avoidance and minimization measures for each of those covered activities. And some of these are pretty substantial because we want to keep the risk to the birds relatively low. And so for example, for off-road vehicles, oversand vehicles, the town has to hire extra monitors that are going to monitor the unfledged chicks while the people are driving by. And there's only certain number of hours per day that you can drive by. And you also have to have an escort that actually gets out of the vehicle or leads a group of vehicles and walks in front of the vehicles in the section of beach where there are unfledged chicks. So they're substantial. So the idea is that we're increasing the risk of losing some chicks, but not all that substantially with those measures that need to be put in place. So another really, really important element of this is that the more birds that we have here in Massachusetts, the more of these special permits that we can issue. So having more birds is no longer a threat to the beach operator because they know that we can allow them to have more flexibility in their management if the population goes up. So you don't need to worry about this chart, but basically this is the chart that says for a certain population size, how many of these permits, so to speak, that we can issue. So another last really big piece of this is there's some risk, right? Like if you allow a parking lot to be open or whatever, of increased mortality, particularly of chicks. This isn't really dangerous so much to the adults, but so to the extent that there's a risk to the birds, it has to be offset with mitigation. And this is a controversial thing here, but selective predator management was one of the main mitigation measures that the scientists and the managers wanted to see. And so it's not the only option. There are others, but operators can either implement predator management. And I want to emphasize it's selective. It's not necessary at every site. It only makes sense at certain sites. But they can pay into essentially a mitigation fund where it'll be implemented at appropriate sites. So they provide mitigation, and that mitigation has to more than offset the impact. So you might have scratched your head when I first started talking about this. Well, how are you going to allow more recreational use and benefit the birds? Well, we would argue we are, because we've now create a situation where there's more acceptance of these management techniques that benefit the population, like selective predator management, that more than offsets any risk, slightly increased risk to the chicks. So in summary, after how many, 2 years or so, we got broad support for the plan. It went out to extensive public comment. The beach buggy people, the conservation groups all endorsed the plan. Definitely reduced the conflict. Definitely toned down the rhetoric. It does provide incentives for good management. And we would argue there are conservation benefits. So that's my my second case study, so to speak. The last one that I want to talk about has to do with habitat management. And it's not enough just to buy land. In some cases, you can buy land, a forest, whatever. Maybe it doesn't require a lot of management. But in other cases, we need to actively manage habitat and land. And why do we do this? Well, the simple answer is a lot of species benefit. And this is species that benefit from prescribed fire and other mechanical measures to open up pine barrens or grasslands or shrublands. And the 162 species, we have something called a state wildlife action plan that has lists at-risk species. And these are the at-risk species or priority species for conservation activities. And about 40% of our state listed species need or benefit from this kind of active management. So I have a grasshopper sparrow, which is rare in Massachusetts. This down here, left hand, is something called the Barron's buck moth, which needs these open pine barrens. It's a really cool moth that flies during the day. So a lot of species need active management in our landscape, human influenced landscape anyway, today in Massachusetts. And then also many game species benefit. I mentioned pine barrens. We have these things called coastal plain ponds in southeastern Massachusetts that have a lot of rare plants, and there's an invasive willow that's taking over a lot of the pond shores. So a lot of our sensitive systems need active management. And there's a lot of different kinds of management, invasive species management. We do prescribed fire. We also do mechanical treatments to open up some of these areas. A lot of different types of management. And so our board and our agency have set goals for grassland, shrubland, and young forest, where, and this shows over time, we've increased the amount of grassland, shrubland, and young forest. We're about maybe 20% of our land would be managed in these open. So we're diversifying the landscape basically so that we can support the full suite of species that we want to preserve on our landscape. And then, so the great majority of our land here, the remaining 70% plus would be managed as forest, more mature forest, basically at any one point in time. There's a lot of research or partners that support this kind of thing. So in the upper right-hand corner is the cover of our grassland bird plan. And we worked with the trustees of reservations, Nature Conservancy, Mass Audubon to produce this plan. And it identifies specific grasslands that we all agreed we ideally need to expand. Two of which we actually, MassWildlife manages and controls the land. State of the Birds, the most recent update of Mass Audubon's State of the Birds has a big emphasis on forest birds. And that's mostly talking about intact forest. But if you read the document, it actually talks about the importance of young forests for certain birds and shrublands for certain birds. So I'm going to just touch on one specific project where for pine barrens, we first worked to use mechanical methods to thin the pine barrens, and then we're going to manage the area long-term with prescribed fire. And This is down in southeastern Massachusetts, and in Plymouth. We have Miles Standish State Forest and some other lands that other folks own. We have a piece. And I don't know if you knew this, but that's actually a hot spot for rare species in Massachusetts, partly and largely because of these pine barrens. And there's a really big wildfire risk. Historically, thousands of acres have burned at a time. I'm showing you a picture here of the Camp Catch-a-Lot Boy Scout camp that burned down in 1964. It's the most important pine barrens, arguably north of the New Jersey Pine Barrens. So there's a significant risk of crown fire because it had gotten really overgrown. What that means is if you look at the right-hand side of this picture, all the trees are really densely packed together. So if a fire gets started, it's going to carry, and there's windy, it's going to carry through the tops of those trees, and firefighters can't really, it's very hard to control. It's really dangerous for firefighters and others that could be in that environment. And so we decided to focus first on the southern part of this Miles Standish landscape, where there were 3 campgrounds. And it's really important habitat. And so on your right-hand side of the screen is an example of a wildfire model that's done. And this is at another site that we had worked on before, where you can see everything's turned yellow. Everything's yellow. There's a little bit of red, but most of it's yellow. And what yellow means is if a fire gets started, it's going to carry through the landscape, but it's going to carry in the understory. It's going to carry through the shrubs and the grasses on the ground, not through the canopy. Now, red is where you have a canopy fire. And Miles Standish, this whole area, thousands of acres, looks like this. There's a lot of red. And the area that we first started working in is hard to see, but it says 250 acres. That's already turned yellow. Now we've done more than 250 acres, but by doing this work, we are benefiting a lot of those species that depend on the shrubland, the shrub layer, and the grassy and herbaceous vegetation, but we're also reducing the wildfire risk. So we worked with DCR that manages the state parks. We worked with the Boy Scouts, and we're doing this hundreds of acres down there now. So again, enhances public and firefighter safety, improves habitat for game and non-game. By the way, it enhances recreational opportunity. It's hard to even walk through some of these overgrown areas. So once people see this, they really enjoy these landscapes. They're aesthetically pleasing. And again, we worked with a variety of partners. So we've done this at a lot of sites. Last thing I'm going to touch on is, okay, well, that's nice, but what about, there's a lot of attention, appropriately so, on storing carbon in natural lands and storing carbon in our forests as part of the response to climate change. It can improve our carbon budget here in the Commonwealth. So we've done a lot of work on that. We did an assessment. So if you go to our website, you'll see information. We also have a magazine article in our MassWildlife magazine that talks about our carbon budget. And long story short, so back in 2006, that's the beginning of this graph, we did a forest inventory where we looked at the different kinds of trees and how big the trees were. And then we could determine how much carbon we were storing on our land. And then we can look at, well, okay, since then, what's happening to the carbon storage? And the dark green at the bottom, that's the increased storage from basically buying and protecting more land. You know, you buy more forest, you're storing more carbon. So some people would say, okay, well, that's great that you guys are doing that. That's important, but that's not really fair if you want to look at the impacts of your habitat work where you're cutting trees. So the light green here, what that is that's the increased storage from forest growth, just the growth of the land we managed in 2006, because the trees are getting bigger, they're storing more carbon. What this tiny little line here is all the carbon that was released from making grasslands and thinning forests and making shrublands. So I'm going to show it one more way. So this kind of says the same thing. So this is, if you imagine all of our land in 2006, we were storing 13.4 million tons estimated of carbon, and that's in the canopy and the forest soils, forest floor. And again, these are estimates based on the best science available. And then we added from land acquisition 5.2 million tons. And then from plant growth on that original acreage, another 1.9 million tons. Now this tiny little leaf is all the carbon that was released from our work. So we would say it's not a choice between being responsible with respect to managing the forest and carbon storage and all these species that need wildlife management. You can essentially have your cake and eat it too. You can do both at the same time if you're smart about it. And again, part of it is we're managing most of our land as forests. So for every 1 unit of carbon released through management, we're adding an additional 17 units of carbon, so to speak. So we're adding about 0.8 tons per acre of carbon over time, even though we're doing this habitat management. So I'm gonna pretty much wrap up just, with where we started, which is we have a really diverse and incredible wildlife here in Massachusetts that's still here, even though we're one of the most densely populated states in the country. And we also, with all the people, have a lot of opportunities to help connect people with wildlife and connect people with conservation, better understand what we need to do to preserve our natural heritage here in the Commonwealth. And with that, I'll take questions.
Well, thanks very much, John. That was excellent. It looks like you do a lot more people managing than wildlife managing, which sounds a bit frustrating for someone who works on wildlife. So let me start with a couple questions about the deer control. There's a question about whether there are efforts to reintroduce deer predators to reduce deer numbers. And along with that, I want to ask, I hear rumors about mountain lions coming back into the state. What can you tell us?
Well, I don't think it's really practical to reintroduce something like a mountain lion into or wolves for that matter into the state, and they wouldn't likely make it, and they wouldn't achieve the densities that would be necessary anyway to really have an impact on the deer population. People have a fascination with mountain lions, and there's a lot more sightings than actual credible occurrences of mountain lions. But we did have a mountain lion that passed through once from South Dakota. We were able to actually get the genetic material, and then I think it might have gotten killed in Connecticut. So it's very rarely been documented, but once or twice in recent history, a mountain lion might have passed through. But we don't have mountain lions here in a resident population.
Well, that's a letdown, but okay. There's also a question about how much of the deer increase is associated with human-made problems. So obviously humans reduced predators, but are other things people are doing like deforestation and urbanization contributing to the deer overpopulation?
Yeah, I think a suburban landscape probably has a better mix for them of plants to eat, because deer like edges. So we're creating more edges in our landscape and openings in our landscape through suburbanization. So yeah, that potentially even makes it that much, the density can go even higher in those landscapes.
Okay, so another question is that I'd like to add to. One is, are there career opportunities for recent undergraduates from Tufts that have finished? And do you need to be an environmental science major for the state to be interested in hiring you? And I guess to that, I'd like to add, are there ways that current students can get involved with wildlife conservation with the state?
Yeah, so we hire people from diverse backgrounds that go beyond even science. So no, you don't necessarily need to have an environmental science degree or a biology degree. Michael, as you mentioned, we're spending as much or more time with dealing with people. And so for example, we've expanded our communication staff recently to help us better engage with our citizens. So you get, we hire people from diverse backgrounds. Now, we have other issues right now related to our finances, which I didn't talk about. We haven't had a hunting and fishing, a significant portion of our revenue comes from hunting and fishing licenses. We haven't had an increase. We haven't increased the fees in 25 years. So for that and other reasons, we're not doing a lot of hiring right now. But yeah, we hire people from diverse backgrounds. And are there opportunities to get involved? Is that what you said, like
Yes.
to get involved with some of our work? I mean, we typically hire a fair number of seasonal employees. Again, we didn't do that this year. We've had interns. I've had people volunteer to work with me on Blanding's turtle trapping, or some work we were doing on red-bellied turtles. So there are potentially opportunities for folks to get involved.
Since you mentioned budget, somebody asked how, and what's the scale of MassWildlife compared to other states? So because we've got a lot of people per square mile, it doesn't sound like you have a large budget per square mile necessarily. How does it compare to wildlife programs in other states?
We're a pretty small fish and wildlife agency. One issue is some of the agencies are kind of like super agencies, like Texas, Missouri. It's parks and it's the wildlife agency in one big agency. We're separate. Like, so there's DCR that manages the parks and the state forests, and then we're a separate agency. So that's one thing that makes us smaller. We're also again, even though it's not all that we do, a big portion of what we do is relating to hunting and fishing, and we don't have that a large number of folks that do that relative to some other states in Massachusetts. So that affects some of our revenue sources. So that affects the size of our agency as well.
Well, for people who are residents of Massachusetts, or your parents are, I will tell you, since John probably isn't allowed to, on your state tax form, there is a box you can check that donates money to wildlife conservation in Massachusetts. So, keep an eye out for that. As a question, if you've seen any evidence of wildlife responding to human activity since the COVID shutdown has occurred, are more people going out and it's interfering with wildlife, or more people staying in and wildlife responding in a positive way? Or are there more conflicts?
So there's been a big resurgence or increased interest in spending time outdoors. Like if you talk to the Mass Environmental Police, like last season, they had to manage crowding in some of the state parks and parking areas. So not our lands also to some extent. So people really wanted to spend time outdoors because it was one of the things that they could do. So we're kind of excited about that. That it's an opportunity for us. Similarly, fishing in particular went through the roof. Like there was a big increase in the number of people buying fishing licenses and going out fishing. So I don't know that it was enough to affect wildlife one way or another, but it certainly changed people's behavior and the amount of time they were spending outdoors.
There's a question about the habitat conservation plan you mentioned for the piping plover, and someone's wondering if these types of multi-user organizational plans are used for other species besides the piping plover.
Well, this sort of permitting framework, these habitat conservation plans, that's a national thing. Like we particularly in like the Western in central parts of the country. For various reasons in the Northeast, there haven't been as many of these habitat conservation plans that allow for more flexible regulation. But yeah, throughout the country, there has been. And we model our permitting though at the state level after on that process largely. So like if there are species that are state listed, like I mentioned a Blanding's turtle. That's not a federally listed species, but it is listed in Massachusetts. So developers have to get permits from us. And we take a pretty flexible approach to mitigation. And you know, I would argue like we've adopted some of those principles in the way we regulate.
So there's a question related to the CBI and the efforts that you're doing with groups trying to bring stakeholders together, and a couple of related questions. And one of them is who pays for that? And another is how do you actually get people who don't like each other to talk to each other?
Yeah, I really love that question because you know, I have a science background, but I am really interested in that process, and I've spent a lot of time being in those situations. Like I had people literally screaming at me, you know, at the beginning of that process about how horrendous they thought it was, or we were. So, I mean, in this particular case, we were able to hire a consultant. We had grant money. Typically, we don't hire a facilitator, but this was a high stakes process. We were able to do it. A lot of our staff, like when I used to do the regulatory review, I actually started this thing where we sent a lot of our staff to at least get training, like through there's something called the Harvard Program on Negotiation. And we sent a lot of folks to have training in how you can negotiate and work with people who have differing viewpoints. So, I mean, you can see the process, you can see people's thinking change when they realize that you're actually willing to listen to them and have like a real dialogue, that you're open, that you're not giving them false promises. Like you're not saying we're going to make it work for you, but you show them that you understand what they're trying to say, what their point of view is, and that you're willing to problem solve with them to try to look for solutions. And it takes a lot of time to build it. But some of the folks that were the most unhappy with us, and philosophically they might not have agreed, by the end were the biggest advocates, because they had influence to like, yes, we can make an agreement with these folks. We can work with them, and bringing other people on board, even though they were started out really at loggerheads with us.
So part of that's just listening. And
part of it is
trust.
listening and being showing that you get where they're coming from, even if you don't necessarily agree.
So you mentioned earlier that, and related to this, that you're having to reach out to people with diversified viewpoints, certainly rural versus urban contrasts.
Yeah.
Is MassWildlife doing anything to reach out to targeted minorities and
yeah,
poor areas and things like that?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, and it's a national issue for Fish and Wildlife agencies, where there's this relevancy movement, because we've collectively realized like we're maybe not effectively serving all of the communities that occur in our states. So I mean, we're putting more attention. That's one of our agency priorities right now. But we do have some programs, like we have something called Teaching with Trout, and where kids raise trout in clams, and that's an example where we've managed to work in a lot of the environmental justice communities that have been identified by the state. We do stocking of fish in some of these urban and environmental justice communities. We recently got a grant for a fishing trailer. So it's a mobile trailer that we can, we got the grant from Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation, and they specifically want us to be using it to reach underserved communities where we can bring fishing programs to those communities. So we're exploring how we can do that better, but those are some of the examples. We need to translate some of our materials. We've talked about that, for example, into Spanish. It's a work in progress, and our staff certainly don't reflect the diversity. It's well known, when I go to national conferences, like we're whiter than our populations, to put it bluntly. We've made progress on gender to some degree, but we have a long way to go.
So I got a question from around where I live that's related to your carbon storage. You're talking about increasing trees for carbon, but you're also talking about increasing grasslands, which they don't go together. And around where I live, they're covering all my grasslands with solar panels.
Yeah.
Are we just about carbon in Massachusetts now?
Well, I guess time will tell. We're saying that we can be about a lot of things at the same time if we do it smartly. That was the point I was trying to make, is you can manage a small portion of your portfolio as grasslands, and still be responsibly increasing the amount of carbon storage on state lands or on our forest lands. And the same goes for solar panels. And I'm not going to speak to that because that's other agencies, but they're looking at, well, how do you incentivize putting those at the right sites? And whatever those right sites are, maybe it's not cutting down a forest, for example, to put the solar panels. Maybe there are better places to put them. Yeah.
Well, let me just end with one easy question. What's the photo in your background?
Oh, this one, I guess I'm gonna have to change it because this one's actually New Hampshire, but that's actually Mount Washington around sunrise. I guess I should put a Massachusetts photo in. Good question.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, John. This is great. If people have more questions, they could drop me or Colin an email or email John. And if there are opportunities that come around, let us know, because COCO has access to a lot of environmental studies students that are looking for internships, and it's a bright, engaged community. So if there's a way they can work with you all to your mutual benefit, let us know.
That'd be great. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it. Appreciate it.